A knock at the door. The sun hung low in the Chicago sky, stretching golden light across the cracked sidewalks of 71st Street. The neighborhood hummed with the sounds of a city refusing to rest. Cars honking, music drifting through open windows, children laughing in the distance. Ebony Jackson stood on her front porch, wiping sweat from her brow. The heat was relentless, thick and heavy, but it wasn't just the temperature making her uneasy. It was the feeling, the kind that crept into your bones before anything had even happened. She had lived here for 30 years. She knew when something wasn't right. The street was too quiet. Then, as if the universe had been waiting for the right moment, the blaring of sirens split through the air. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of her house, their red and blue lights bouncing off the brick walls. 4 officers stepped out, their movements coordinated. 2 rehearsed to be casual. Ebony's stomach twisted. She had done nothing wrong. So why did it feel like she was already guilty of something? The approach. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a calculated gaze, stepped forward. His badge gleamed under the sun. "Ma'am, do you live here?" His voice was cool, authoritative. Ebony stood straighter. She wasn't about to be intimidated on her own porch. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" The second officer, a stocky woman with sharp eyes, glanced at the house before turning her attention back to Ebony. Her stare was heavy, searching, like she was waiting for Ebony to flinch. "We received a report about suspicious activity at this residence," the male officer continued, flipping open a small notepad. "Would you mind answering a few questions?" "Suspicious activity." Ebony's brows knit together. "What kind of suspicious activity?" The woman officer stepped in, arms crossed. "Possible drug-related exchange. A woman matching your description was seen involved in a transaction outside this house." For a moment, Ebony was stunned into silence. Then she let out a sharp laugh. "Excuse me?" She narrowed her eyes. "I think you've got the wrong woman." The officers didn't look convinced. "Ma'am," the male officer pressed, "can we see some identification?" Ebony clenched her jaw. Every part of her wanted to tell them to get off her property. But she knew better. She moved slowly, pulling her wallet from the pocket of her loose cotton dress and handing over her driver's license. The officer inspected it, passing it to his partner. She held onto it longer than necessary, her expression unreadable. The radio on the male officer's shoulder crackled. Static, then a voice. Nothing clear. Finally, they handed the ID back. "You got any reason someone might call us with this kind of report?" Ebony's fingers tightened around her wallet. "No, officer. I mind my business, just like I expect others to mind theirs." The woman officer tilted her head. "You live alone." Ebony crossed her arms. "That's not relevant." She could feel the weight of their suspicion. It didn't matter that she had been here longer than most of her neighbors. It didn't matter that she had built a life here, raised a daughter, contributed to her community. In their eyes, she fit a description. And that was enough. Pushing the limits. "We might need to take a look inside," the male officer said, his voice casual, like he was asking for a glass of water instead of access to her home. Ebony took a step back. "Unless you've got a warrant, that's not happening." A tense silence. The woman officer shifted her weight. She wanted to push. Ebony could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way her fingers twitched near her belt. But the male officer exhaled sharply. "Fine. We'll be back." Ebony didn't move until they had retreated to their cars. Even then, she stayed on the porch, watching as they sat in their vehicles for too long, talking into their radios, casting glances at her house. Eventually, they drove away. But the unease stayed. Who had called them? And why? Ebony turned, stepping back into her house and locking the door behind her. Her hands were shaking. She needed to calm down. She needed to think. And then, before she even realized she was doing it, she was reaching for her phone. Scrolling. Finding a name she hadn't seen on her screen in months. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She hesitated. She didn't want to worry Kesha. Her daughter was busy. A government job. Something secretive. Something important. But still, a mother's instinct was hard to ignore. And right now, that instinct was telling her, something isn't right. Ebony took a breath and pressed call. The other side of the world. At that moment, 1,200 miles away, in a secure government facility just outside of Langley, Virginia, Kesha Jackson was scanning intelligence files. The room was dim, the hum of computer screens filling the space as classified data flickered across them. Kesha was 30 years old, sharp-eyed, and fiercely intelligent. She had trained at the CIA's elite facility, the Farm, where she had outperformed seasoned agents in combat, psychological warfare, and strategy. Rumors swirled about her in Langley. Some said she had single-handedly dismantled a cartel operation in South America. Others claimed she had infiltrated an underground network in Eastern Europe. The truth, no one really knew, because Kesha didn't leave footprints. Officially, she was an intelligence analyst. Unofficially, she was one of the most skilled operatives in the country. Her personal phone buzzed. She blinked. Mom. That was rare. She glanced around the room. No one was watching. She picked up. Mom. Her voice softened. Hey, baby. Ebony's voice was steady, but Kesha caught the tension underneath. I didn't mean to interrupt your day. Something weird happened. Kesha's posture straightened. What happened? Ebony sighed. The cops showed up today. Said someone called in a report about me. Said I was involved in some transaction. Kesha's stomach tightened. What? I don't know who made the call, but they said they might come back with a warrant. Silence. Then, do you want me to come home? Ebony exhaled. No, baby, I just wanted to tell you. I can handle it. She hesitated. Kesha's jaw clenched. Her mother never hesitated. I just don't like the way they were looking at me, Ebony admitted. Like they'd already decided who I was. Kesha's fingers curled into fists. She had spent years keeping her work a secret from her mother. It was for her safety. The less Ebony knew, the better. But now, something wasn't right. Kesha forced herself to breathe. Okay, she said, but if anything else happens, you tell me immediately. Promise. Ebony chuckled lightly. Now, since when did you become the overprotective one? Promise me, Mom. A pause. Then, I promise. Kesha hung up and stared at her screen. She had a briefing in 10 minutes. But for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she could focus. A warning bell was going off in her head. And every instinct she had, every skill the CIA had drilled into her, told her, go home. Because if there was one thing Kesha Jackson had learned over the years, it was this. When someone messed with her family, they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The calm before the storm. A sense of unease. Ebony Jackson wasn't the type to dwell on fear. She had spent her whole life standing her ground. As a mother, as a community leader, and as a woman who had built a life in a city that demanded resilience. But something about this felt different. She sat in her small living room, the television flickering with muted news updates, her mind elsewhere. The cops had said they'd be back. For what? She had no criminal record, no involvement in anything shady. The idea that someone had reported her for drug-related activity was absurd. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, long enough to know how things worked. Someone wanted trouble. The question was, who? She thought about calling her lawyer, but something in her gut told her this wasn't just about legalities. This was about something bigger. And for the first time in a long while, she felt alone. Her late husband, Marcus, had always handled situations like this with a quiet strength. He had been a man of few words but of unshakable principles, the kind of man who never backed down when it came to protecting his family. Now it was just her, or Almost just her. Her eyes flickered to her phone. Kesha. She had already called once. She didn't want to burden her daughter. Kesha had a life. A serious, important job that Ebony only knew bits and pieces about. But Ebony also knew her daughter better than anyone, and she knew Kesha wasn't one to ignore warning signs. Meanwhile, in Langley, Kesha Jackson sat in a sleek, windowless conference room deep inside a secure CIA facility in Langley, Virginia. A massive digital screen dominated the front of the room, displaying a map with flashing markers. A classified mission briefing. Senior intelligence officers sat around the long table, speaking in hushed, clipped tones. But Kesha wasn't listening. Not really. Her mind was still in Chicago. Her mother's voice had lingered in her ears long after they had hung up. Something wasn't right. She had learned to trust her instincts. That was how she had survived the farm, the brutal CIA training ground that had shaped her into what she was today. But right now, every instinct she had was telling her to get home. Agent Jackson. The voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned, locking eyes with Deputy Director Austin Price, one of the most respected figures in the agency. "You with us?" he asked, his gaze sharp. Kesha straightened in her chair. "Yes, sir." Price studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Good, because we need you sharp for this." Kesha was sharp. Always. But today, her focus was elsewhere. And Price must have seen it, because after the briefing ended, he pulled her aside. "You've got something on your mind?" he asked. Kesha hesitated for a split second, too long. Price was former field ops. He could read people like an open book. "It's nothing," Kesha said. "Just some family stuff." Price's expression didn't change. "Family stuff," he repeated. "The kind that can wait." Kesha's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet," she admitted. Price studied her, then gave a small nod. "Then find out. You've got 48 hours. Take care of whatever it is." She blinked. "Sir." Price smirked. "You think I don't know how you work? If your head isn't in the game, then you're no use to me. So go, figure out what's got you rattled. And if it's nothing, fine. But if it's something..." His smirk faded. "You know what to do." Kesha exhaled. "Yes, sir." Price patted her shoulder. "Get moving, Jackson." And that was all she needed. She was already on her way. The return. Ebony was washing dishes when she heard the knock at the door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it made her blood run cold. She dried her hands, her heart pounding. She knew who it was before she even looked through the peephole. They had come back. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and opened it. The same two officers, Anders and Cooch. But this time, they weren't alone. Another officer stood behind them, and this time, they weren't asking. "We need you to come with us," Anders said, his voice clipped. "We have some additional questions." Ebony crossed her arms. "About what?" Anders didn't flinch. "We'd prefer to discuss it at the station." Cooch took a step forward. "Ma'am, we're not asking." Ebony felt a wave of something close to rage wash over her. But she wasn't reckless. She had spent her whole life playing by the rules. And right now, she had to be smart. She grabbed her purse, locked the door, and stepped outside. The entire block was watching. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Some stood on their porches, silent. Not helping. Not stopping it. Just watching. Ebony lifted her chin and walked to the car, sliding into the back seat. As they pulled away, she caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a black SUV, parked at the corner. Engine running. Watching. Ebony had lived long enough to recognize a tail when she saw one. And something told her. Her daughter was already here. The arrival. The police station smelled of old coffee and stale air. Ebony sat in a cold metal chair inside a small interrogation room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, Anders and Cooch stood, arms crossed. "We're just trying to clear some things up," Anders said, flipping through a folder. Ebony didn't respond. She had nothing to say. She wasn't stupid. She knew the drill. They were waiting for her to slip up. But she wasn't going to. She sat. She waited. And then the door opened. Anders and Cooch turned, confused. A man in a dark suit stepped in, his badge flashing as he moved. CIA. And behind him, Kesha. She was dressed in a sleek blazer, a crisp shirt, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She looked every bit the professional, every bit the woman they should never have messed with. Kesha's expression was unreadable as she placed a single file on the table. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth, calm. "We need to have a conversation." Anders frowned. "Excuse me, but this is a mistake," Kesha interrupted. "One that ends now." She slid the file across the table. Anders hesitated, then opened it. His face lost all color. Ebony didn't know what was in that file, but she knew whatever it was enough. Because in that moment, everything shifted. Anders and Cooch weren't in control anymore. Her daughter was. The moment of reckoning. The daughter's power. Kesha Jackson sat across from the two officers, her face calm, but her presence commanding. She had seen men like Anders and Cooch before. Arrogant, certain of their power, convinced they could get away with whatever they wanted. But today was different. Today, they had made a mistake, and now they were about to learn exactly who they had been dealing with. Anders flipped through the file Kesha had slid across the table, his eyes scanning the pages. His fingers tightened on the edge of the document. The color drained from his face. Cooch, who had been standing stiffly beside him, leaned over and took a look. Within seconds, her jaw tensed. She didn't like what she was seeing. At all. Ebony watched from her seat, her hands still folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had no idea what was in that file, but she had seen enough in her life to recognize power shifting when it happened. And right now, the power was shifting. To Kesha. To her. Kesha leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Her voice was quiet, measured, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "Let's talk about that anonymous tip, shall we?" she said, her tone dangerously smooth. Anders said nothing. Cooch cleared her throat. "We're just following protocol." Kesha arched a brow. Interesting, because protocol doesn't explain why two officers chose to harass an innocent woman, without cause, without evidence, and without backup from an actual investigation. Anders exhaled sharply. "We were acting on a call." Kesha tapped the file in front of them. That call, it was untraceable. No record of it, which means either you two fabricated a reason to bring my mother here, or someone fed you false information, and you didn't bother to verify it before you showed up at her door. She tilted her head. "Now which is it?" The room fell into silence. Ebony watched her daughter work. She had seen Kesha's intelligence from the time she was a little girl. The way she noticed details others missed. The way she always assessed situations before speaking. She had never seen her lose an argument. And she wasn't about to start now. Kesha let the silence stretch. Let it become uncomfortable. Then she leaned back in her chair and said 7 words that sent a shiver down Ebony's spine. "You have no idea who I am." Anders finally spoke. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this isn't some TV show," he snapped. "This is real life, and we don't answer to." "Actually," Kesha interrupted smoothly, "you do. Because as of this moment, there's a formal internal investigation into your conduct." She pushed another document across the table. "This," she tapped the page. "This is an official inquiry into your recent stops and detainments. You've got a history, Officer Anders. Several anonymous tips leading to incidents just like this one. And Officer Cooch, you're not exactly clean either." Cooch's face darkened. "This is ridiculous." Kesha shrugged. "Maybe. But it's still happening. And the way I see it, you have two choices." She held up one finger. "One, you formally apologize to my mother, walk out of this room, and never pull this stunt again." She held up a second finger. "Or two, I make sure this report lands on the desk of every major civil rights attorney, journalist, and oversight committee in the country. And trust me." Her gaze hardened. "You don't want that." Anders' jaw clenched. He knew. He had already lost. Justice serve. The apology was begrudging, but it happened. Ebony Jackson sat in her chair as two uniformed officers apologized to her. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. And when Kesha escorted her mother out of that police station, heads turned. They weren't stopping her anymore. They weren't looking at her like a suspect. They were looking at her like a woman they should have never crossed. Mother and daughter. The ride home was quiet at first. Ebony stared out the window, taking it all in. Then finally, she turned to Kesha. "I don't know what you did," she said slowly, "but I know you ended that situation in a way I never could." Kesha kept her hands on the wheel. "You shouldn't have had to go through it in the first place." Ebony studied her daughter's face. Kesha had always been strong, but now she realized her daughter wasn't just strong. She was powerful, and for the first time in a long while, Ebony felt truly safe. She reached over, squeezed Kesha's hand. "You are your father's child," she murmured, "and I've never been prouder of you." Kesha squeezed back. "I'll always protect you, Mom." And Ebony believed her. Because when you have a daughter who is a legend, you're never truly alone. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.